Okay. So now we have some entity called Cryo user. Some user, yeah. So this was the minimum table that we have used and interacted with the database and exposed them as a web service. Today we are going to talk more deeper into how to create entities. I mean, you see this class because I mentioned here, right? That's why this is an entity. Entity means we are mapping with the database. So now I'm creating one more entity. Again, it's a Java class. I'm saying Cryo address. Okay. Once you have a Java class, just make it as an entity. Oh. Okay, and automatically this will become Hibernate entity class. And then what is the table name that we want to map the database, whatever the table. So now I'm doing table name. What is the property that is, okay, name. So name equal to, I am mapping this entity class to a table in the database that is Cryo address. Eventually I'll create the table also in the database. Without creating a Cryo address table in the database, this entity won't work. Okay, so exactly whatever you are giving, your table name should match the name that is mentioned on line number 7. Now, just like the way I am creating, I'll copy one column from here. So now I want to use a different ID rather than creating like that. Okay, I am taking auto-generated ID. I'll explain you how this works. So the first column I am creating as an ID. So you see here, right? So what that means, ID is identifier of the entity, how you want to identify an entity. So to do that, you need at least one of the column on this table should have this one, line number 13, @ID. That means whenever this class is loaded with data, so Hibernate will treat this column as an identifier for Cryo address entity.
So, I mean, whichever column has a primary key in the database, that should be the ID, right?
Usually, yes. That's how it should be. So now when I say ID, automatically this column should be unique in the database.
Okay.
And moreover, all the values in this ID will be different, right?
Pardon me?
Like whatever the values given in the ID, those are different from one another, right?
Yeah, one another. Yeah, primary key. Primary key means every ID in the table, meaning let's say you have 100 rows, and every row the ID value should be unique and not null.
Yeah, and whenever we add the data, like ID created automatically, right?
That is different. I'll come to that point in later point of time. I mean, ideally that's how it happened. But I don't want to ask you to go that route. I mean, I'll explain you eventually. I mean, I'm moving you slowly, so don't worry about how the ID generates and auto generates.
Yeah.
So for now, you have this ID, and I'm saying address ID. That's the column I'm mapping in the database. And the second one is, I'm giving the column name as street address. Now, street address.
What happens if I give @ID for the street address? I mean, compiler just checks.
Yeah.
Compiler just checks the @ID, right?
Yes. You can't make two columns and ID on the same table.
No. I mean, instead of the private long ID, instead of giving @ID for the first column, what happens if I give it for the second column?
Then no
No
street
problem.
name should be repeated.
You can make ID for any column of your choice.
No, I mean in the database, the ID has a primary key, but in the plain old Java object class, we are giving ID as the street name.
Hibernate does not worry about how you do it. Even though you make it will work. But whenever, if it sees two objects having same street name, it will come. It will give you an error, runtime error.
Okay.
So in the database, you can make every column primary, no problem. So Hibernate will go through whatever the identifier you have mentioned on the same.
Okay. Yeah.
So now street name. Let's say I keep only 2 columns for now. Eventually we'll do more and more. Now.
Sorry, is this recording?
I think so. I'm doing it. Yep, it's happening. So now, once we have the ID, and let's say I'm trying to generate the SQL query for it. Okay, Docker local. So now we have created an prio address table, an entity. Now I'm creating the address class, prio address, and the first column is address ID, and the second column is street name. And I'm making address ID as primary key. Okay. Okay, full stack only, right? The database that we are using. Okay, full stack. So now, if you see here, you have the prio address and prio user. Now, two entities and 2 tables are there. Now, in the user, my requirement is every one user can have one address. Per se, that is my requirement. Now, to do that, you can do 1 to 1. One user object to one address object. 1 to 1. Let me get the syntax. I did this many times. Let's get the syntax. I need to join the column. I'm just getting the syntax. Be patient with me a minute. Okay. No mapping here. Okay, join the column. So now 1 to 1 mapping, and what column you want to join between 2 tables. So join column name. So I am saying this table should map with address ID on the second column. No, something like this. User ID. What is that here? I don't have user ID here. Oh, shit. Okay. So I'm adding the user ID also on this column, on this entity, user ID, and I'm removing the ID on the identifier. So now this has a user ID, first name, last name. Now I'm joining to join column one-to-one. User ID, name is user ID, and entity. Which entity I'm mapping one-to-one? That is Cryo address. Address. Now, I'm just creating get and set methods for the address. Okay, that's for ID also. Now, user table has user ID, first name, last name, and I'm having a mapping to prior address, one-to-one, meaning one user object can hold only one address object. That's it. So now, in this side, I am having address ID and street name. That's all. Now, generate getters and methods for ID and street name also. Okay. So now two sides entity definitions are complete. Now let's go back and create the tables. So when we are creating tables, we need to follow a different structure. So that's why I am dropping the existing tables on it. I mean, for now, I am showing you all manual process. Eventually, I'll show you how to create all these scripts in an automated way. So now, in the create user, what I'm trying to do is, we have in the prior user table, we will have address, the user ID, last name, first name, and primary key can be user ID. That's our identifier on the user table. This is how the user table will be. And similarly, the address table will be the same, but because of the relation that we are having here, right, user ID join column, so that means that the user entity will expect user ID column on the address table. So meaning the user ID, this one, will be created here. Something like this will be created. So now two tables, and the relation between these two tables is user ID column. So I'm not creating foreign key here. Ideally, we should create foreign key also. I mean, you already know about this, how to create all foreign key constraints. So without having key constraints at the database level, still Hibernate will work that out in the object level here. So that's why I'm not creating the foreign keys in the table. Ideally, you are supposed to create the foreign keys on the table database level. So let's see. Okay. All right.
The primary key, user ID.
Oh, I see. Okay. So now two tables are created. Refresh all. Yep. We got the two tables are here, and then we are having all this mapping. Now let's go back to user service implementation. We already have, service implementation in previous class. Get user details, right? So this will give from the database. So here we are doing user first name, last name, something like this, right? So now what we can do, or what I'm going to do here is, this is the simplest example I showed you other day. Today now what I'm going to do is user details I'm changing the object name mesh. So now user details dot put the first name key is first name and value is user dot get first name, and similarly I'm doing user details dot put last name. I'm keeping all the data that is needed for the web service. So last name user dot get last name, and now the new one that we have added, right? User details dot put what is the street name this guy lives. So how you get the street name? User dot get address. This will give you address object, meaning address entity object, dot. This address object actually has street name. So now if you see here, the street name is not coming from user table. Street name is coming from address table. So now once we have it, I'm adding user, it's K. Oh, this is map. Okay. List, I'm changing this. So now I'm adding users dot add and keep on adding all the users one by one. So now I got all the users in the array list users. Now I'm changing the method return types also because I'm sending the list of users. So that's why I'm saying list of, what is that list? It should contain list of map objects. That's what we are filling here. String and map. So, and now it still complains. You see here, right? It still complains because I'm returning the users. What is the users? So here no. Now it's a list of maps, and now I'm creating map each time. So once I'm getting all the user objects from the database, creating a map and keeping all the details related to user in the map, and then I'm adding them back to users. See here, it still complains, okay? User details. Yeah. So creating a map and adding all the maps back into users list and returning the users. So now you see here, this line is still complaining because it is the overridden method from user DAO interface. In the DAO interface, return type is not list of maps. That's why it stopped giving a problem. This is just a map. So now I'm changing it to list of maps in the definition. Now automatically the error got resolved. So now it will return, the DAO layer will return list of users, each user having first name, last name, and street name. So now when it is coming to you see here, right, this is also again complaining because user DAO.details will return list of maps. So automatically the return type needs to be changed. So again, this will complain you because the definition is just a map rather than list of maps. Now I'm changing this also. Okay, now this should solve the problem. So now So where is the service layer is called, I think, user controller. Now you see here, right? This is also again problem because once you change the return type in one of the place in the entire chain, you need to make changes across the chain, to resolve the conflicts. So now all your service layer, controller layer, DAO layer, entity changes, creating tables, everything is done. Now let's look at how this behaves. Just run Spring Boot run. Okay. Let's see, get user. No. What is the method name? Okay, user details. The service is user details. Now you see, it's a list, but empty, meaning the overall the service is working, but you're not getting any data because no data is available in the database. Now let's start looking at this. Now insert into your user. What is that? User underscore ID, first underscore name, last underscore name, values. So ID I'm giving 1, first name, Govardhan, last name, Singarati. That's it. This is our user record. Now, similarly, we need to insert address record. Underscore address underscore ID, and street underscore name, user underscore ID, values, address ID, again in an integer, I'm keeping 1. I mean, this number can be anything. I mean, I'm just created a random 1. Address ID can be 100 or any number of your choice. And the street name, Fernald, common, and user ID. The user ID should exactly match whatever the user ID you have mentioned in the prior user. So user ID is 1. Not done. Now let's go back because we have inserted some one record in user, one record in address. So now this is supposed to show results. So it throws an error.
Yes, like there is no address ID in this address file, what we have given in Java.
Yeah, this is the address ID, right? I mean, I given address ID 100. So
No, not here, in that file.
In the entity class?
Yeah.
Oh, no, it should be. So this is user ID, and then let's see the prior address. Yeah, this is the ID, correct. So let's look at and see what is going on. I mean, here it generates the query. You see here, right? The query generated. This query is throwing error. Null pointer exception. So whenever you run that query, Hibernate generates this kind of queries. That, when you need to troubleshoot, then just copy paste the query and run against the database and see is there any problem with the query first. No, the data is there. First name, last name, but address is 0. Why? See, you see here, right? Address is coming as now. Prior address to this dot user ID equal to, oh, this is wrong. The way the query is generated is wrong. You see here, the user table user ID equal to address table dot user ID. This is how the query should be generated. This is how the query should be generated, but that is not happening here. It's happening reverse. You will see. If I say address ID, the address ID will come here. Okay. Okay, I did, I think, reverse. Okay, let's see. And I always generate these queries automatic, so I never write manual. Okay, I created, I just moved around address ID, and then I don't need this user ID here. Then I don't need it here. Something like this. Okay, I'm recreating this. I'll explain. Let me work that out.
We have to give that address ID.
Yeah, I'm given. Okay. So now I did this, and let me run the reboot the application. I just switched around the column names. That's all I did. Yeah. So now you see here last name, first name, and street name. So now what did I do here is the switching that I did here is I created one-to-one with which column? Address ID column on the prior address table. So when I do like this, the address ID column will be created, should be there in the user table. That's the switch around I did. So now you see here address ID column is available on the user table, and based on this address ID, it will be mapped with the address table. So, and then once you generate the query, you can see the query generation is something like here. Outer join, this dot address ID means user dot address ID equal to address dot address ID. So this is how the Hibernate will generate the SQL query. Just because of the join we have added one-to-one, right? Automatically it added all these joins to generate that query. So we are not creating any of these queries anywhere. If you see here, nowhere we are creating this, it automatically generates it. So now let's say if I'm adding multiple records. Let's say I'm adding 2 and And I'm creating one more address, 101, and address is Fremont. So now I have created one more address record, and I'm adding Arun with that specific address. Now let's come back and refresh the same thing. You will see 2 users now. Now you can see, Arun Sankramadhi and Fremont. So that's how you can have one-to-one mappings between 2 entities and establish relations between 2 tables. Any questions? You're able to understand?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like we used to do, before we used to do in SQL, MySQL, but right now we are doing in this Java, right?
Yes.
The last switch that you did, I did not understand that properly.
Okay, sure. So now here, these are all pretty straightforward. Here I am doing, in the entity class, I am doing one-to-one mapping with this entity object, prior address object. So look, everything is in a object-oriented approach. Forget about how the tables are. So now the prior user entity is having one-to-one relation with prior address table. How the relation needs to be established? The address ID in the prior address entity should match is a relation key between user and address. Meaning, whenever you add it like this, that means address ID column will be generated on this table also. User table also. This will one-to-one in mapping will generate address ID column on user table. And when Hibernate generates the SQL queries, because you have the mapping, based on this mapping, Hibernate will internally generate query and adds, left outer join and adding this query relationship. That's how you can do one-to-one mapping. So in the address table, you should have address ID column. I mean, that's the relation between user and address. So this one. Let's say if you change this to some XXX, Hibernate will get confused and it will throw errors. So which column you are establishing a relation between 2 entities.
Okay.
Okay. Any more questions?
So we can change it to user ID also, right? One-to-one can be changed to user ID, and that prior user should be of user ID.
So then this mapping should go other side, because wherever you are mapping, we are establishing relation from this object to the address. So this is the source. So that's why I'm giving the other side of the address ID. Let's say if you want to establish relation from address to here, let's say if you do something like this side, then you cannot do like this. Address ID is already available in the address table. How do you want to map to the user? So that means you are mapping to the user, and this is user. How? How do you want to establish relation from user table? So this will become user. So this will become user ID column on the user table. That's how we wanted to establish the relation otherwise. Right? So depending on which side you are starting the relation. If you start from address side, you have to establish a relation as a user ID to the user table. If you want to establish relation from user side, you have to do like this. Based on from which source to the destination, you are establishing the relationship.
Okay.
Got it?
Yeah, got it.
Hey, any more questions?
No questions.
No question.
No questions.
Okay, sure. So I will stop here. You can practice this relationship only one-to-one. If you want to practice one-to-many, you can do that. But I'll explain you. There are 4 different relations: one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, many-to-many. So I will go over all 4 relationships. Tomorrow what I'm going to do is I won't I won't give you the next relationship. What I'm going to explain you is create an entity and generate, whatever the script you're seeing here, right, is manually entered. So now, based on the entities, automatically the script file will be generated, and copy the script, come over here, just execute it. There is no need of writing any of this manual. We don't worry about how database works. Hibernate will take care of generation of script and running all that stuff. So I will explain you how you can create that automatically. Once you understand how the automated queries are generated, then I will explain you next 3 relationships.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So practice more and more samples. Hibernate is pretty complicated. I'll go a little bit slower. So at least for the next 5 to 10 classes, then once you're comfortable,